All right, listeners worldwide, welcome to this Noxos Live Q&A with pianist, arranger, transcriber, the list of adjectives goes on, Eleonor Bindman. We are streaming live via Facebook and YouTube. We are happy to bring this interview to you today. And we will be talking with Eleonor for the next hour or so. If you have a comment or a question, please feel free to drop it in the chat window in the website where you're watching this. And we will be able to see your comment. We may be able to address it later on in this hour. But in any case, welcome. And Eleonor, thank you so much for being here and talking with us today.
Thank you, Nick, for having me. And I'm very happy to talk about my work because I don't get a chance to do that in depth very often. Just fortunately, the recordings are out there. So in a sense, that speaks for itself. But there are many interesting aspects of transcription, piano duet playing, and there's always more to say about Bach. So this is great. And thank you, everyone who's watching.
Absolutely. And yeah. Thank you for being so willing to talk about multiple elements of what you do, because as we've already sort of seen in the introduction video, you have this new album out of transcriptions of Bach's orchestral suites for piano duet. We'll see later some video of you recording four hands with your piano duet partner. We'll talk about that more later. But there are multiple albums of this material, right? And you've devoted so much of your life as an artist to Bach, who is an artist who musicologists are still writing about, performers are still recording and reimagining his work. And it's a pleasure and a privilege to have you here talking about that work and that mission. So in terms of just learning about the project, why you undertook it, what went into it, my first question is just, how did the album come about? How did you start working with Grand Piano Records?
Well, as you mentioned before, Nick, this is a multi-stage project. And this album is a direct sequel, one might say, of my Brandenburg Duets album, which came out on the Grand Piano label also in 2018. So when I originally decided to make the transcription, and we'll talk about the process later, but once the transcription was completed, I realized that I really need to make a recording of it, because my initial intention of this being material for study, which my intention is still there, but I quickly learned that to hope to publish it was somewhat futile, especially at that stage. And I also was thinking that, well, how will the people understand the quality of the work? And why would any publisher even want to look at a score, because nobody's really going to play through all of it? So I realized very quickly that the recording needed to come first. And fortunately, Jenny Lin was available at the time, who was a very busy recording artist, but she really very quickly said, I really understand the importance of this project. It's a great project and I want to do it. So I put together a proposal, and we both thought that grand piano would be a perfect label for it, because this is new material and this is a complete set of Bach. And fortunately, as you said, Bach is somebody who people still write about and always will write about. And Naxos being the biggest distributor of classical music and other music in the world, that they know that Bach is still the most popular composer. So in a way, the project spoke for itself. And Jenny and I made a couple of demo videos. We made a few movements, we recorded videos, and those also spoke for themselves. And I was fortunate enough to be offered a recording contract, which made me very happy, without too many hoops to have to jump through, which in this day and age in the industry, it's not easy to get a recording contract. So that's how it came about. And then after the Brandenburg duets were streaming and released, and were actually quite popular, even as far as the physical sales of the album, especially in Europe, were going very well. Then I thought, well, the natural thing to do would be to do the orchestral suites. But because of the sheer volume and size and complexity of the project, I had to take a little breather. And then finally, actually, when COVID started, is when I started the first stage of the project, which was, to start transcribing. And there are many stages. So I finally was done this April, when I finally recorded it with Susan Sobolewski. So that's, a long story short in a way. And fortunately, Grand Piano was obviously very interested in welcoming and supporting this project. And in between, there were the cello suites for piano, which kind of came out in about. And there are also other transcriptions that in this process, which basically took 8 years at this point, because I started the Brandenburgs in 2014. There are a lot of other offshoots of Bach transcriptions, which I enjoy doing, which weren't as daunting to complete.
Right. And we're hosting this today in collaboration with Archive Music, which is a music retail website where, if you are interested in a physical copy of Eleanor's album or any of her work, you can find it there. But I should also note that folks should feel free to head over to your website, your personal professional website, because you have so much of the sheet music there available, including some sheet music that are that's really aimed at younger learners who are just starting out. And it's a wonderland of Bach transcriptions over there. I highly recommend it.
Thanks. Thank you
Yeah.
very much. And I just wanted to briefly interject that not only the young learners, but also actually a cross-section of the piano playing population, which I found myself very drawn to also as a teacher, are adult amateurs. And ever since these projects came about and the transcriptions, the most letters of appreciations that I get come from adult amateurs at the moment, because they already know and appreciate the music that I transcribe, and they're able to play it.
Right, which is a wonderful thing, to welcome more people, right, into the community of those who not only love Bach, but play Bach. So let's talk a little bit more about transcription, actually, because this is as we've sort of already implied, this is a multi-year, multimedia project for you. Transcriptions, reductions, whatever we want to call them. I mean, anyone familiar with Fantasia, the Disney movie, has heard Bach's music transcribed for from keyboard to orchestra, right? That's a route of sort of translation that I think a lot of people are familiar with, but it still feels kind of radical to perform Bach's orchestral music on keyboards. Max Reger, the composer and arranger and theorist, made these transcriptions of the orchestral suites over 100 years ago. But you know, they sort of leave certain things to be desired. They're very thickly textured. Why do you think so few people have tried to play Bach's orchestral music on the keyboard? And how did you become the person who took the leap in our time?
A lot of different questions there. So I'm not really sure where to start. Transcriptions in general, of course, we know that Bach, first and foremost, was somebody who not only put his own works into different instrumentations, but also transcribed works by Vivaldi, for example, and other Italian contemporaries of his. And he actually transcribed them for keyboard. As a matter of fact, in another small offshoot, which I call Stepping Stones to Bach, which I did 2 volumes of, and back in 2019, I actually include Bach's own transcription or a fragment of a Vivaldi piece, which is very interesting. I think that transcribers, probably by nature, out of the entire pool, I would say most people would be either conductors or pianists. And of course, conductors, any educated conductor is also more than a decent pianist. There's something about this habitual necessity to be dealing with many voices at once. And of course, there are other instruments such as the guitar or the harp where one is in control of many different musical lines, but of course, it doesn't really compare to an orchestra or a piano, of course, to a lesser extent. So it's much easier in a way to dress up a keyboard piece for orchestra. Because you can add sonorities without changing the actual piece. You can add different instrumentation, dynamics, and effects, and the piece will seem enhanced. Going the other way, of course, is a lot more difficult because one needs to do justice to the piece. So people like Liszt and Rachmaninoff and Busoni, who were major virtuosos and transcribers also of Bach, were actually able, well, Liszt also transcribed a lot of other things and operatic paraphrases and so on, but they were able to actually execute these multifaceted textures, and they ended up writing very difficult pieces in the virtuoso style of, you know, about 100, 140, 50 years ago, which, you know, the pianist virtuoso just kind of came about. So those types of pieces on the piano were only possible to execute if you had tremendous technique. So when it comes to specifically these Bach pieces, as you mentioned, Max Reger, who was a composer and a transcriber and a conductor and a performer, didn't do a very good job, and I think that it was only because he probably was busy doing many other things, and one needed to be really meticulous to be able to do a successful transcription. So as you mentioned, he just has all the treble in the primo part, then all the bass parts, which are actually very sparse because it's in the orchestration, it's just cello and double basses, or whatever the equivalents were during Bach's time. They were called something else, maybe. And it's really not only not gratifying for a partnership of 2 pianists, but it's also impossible to execute, especially up tempo. And hence, when I was considering transcribing this myself, I was actually extremely surprised that nobody has done it better since he has done it. And then it occurred to me, as I was asking, you know, why me? Because as I started doing it, I had many hours of, you know, self-doubt and frustration because I didn't realize how much it would take and all the stages I've done orchestral transcriptions before, but not of such, dizzying counterpoint, because counterpoint is the issue in these particular transcriptions, and that's what doesn't translate if you just have one person playing all the top and the other playing the bottom. So I was asking myself a lot, why exactly am I doing this, and why hasn't anyone else done it, and what is it about? Why am I doing it? Why can I do it? But it was mostly kind of the reverse. Why hasn't anyone else done it? And there are several answers to that, but the primary one is that, just like Liszt or Rachmaninoff, I actually wanted to play the music, and this music would be impossible to play on one piano, absolutely impossible. Solo piano. Four hands was a decision that just was a practical one, because how many people have access to two pianos on a regular basis? So, and I was also redoing the existing Rager transcription. But I realized that, first and foremost, since I wanted to play it, I had the Rager transcriptions on my bookshelves, and Susan and I tried to play through them, years apart. And we were like, I don't want to do the secondo, and I don't want to do the primo either. So it was useless. But I found that actually nobody is performing them. And I was very interested in performing them. And I also have done transcriptions in the past. And I also was not daunted by looking at the orchestral score. I mean, I was in a sense, but I was educated enough, and I had enough of a background. I played viola in high school, for example. So the alto clef was not a trouble for me to read. And some concertos are more complex than others as far as the instrumentation and orchestra. The concerto number 1 is very difficult because it has, French horns, which are written in a completely different key. It has a violin solo, which is, a half a step higher. It has, of course, the oboes, which are in a different key, and it has the strings. And one really needs to focus tremendously just to be able to go to the score and distill what's happening there in the first place. So I think that, because I did like to, I took a lot of classes, orchestral score analysis. It was something that I didn't find daunting. And I think, as a pianist, I didn't find the confluence of many voices, and as a lover of Bach and a frequent performer and my favorite composer, all of this kind of became somewhat doable. It was difficult, but it was doable. But I think the orchestral score reading is really a very large factor in being able to make what you call, correctly, it is more or less a reduction.
Yeah, I think not everyone who has maybe not worked with orchestral transcription or just looking at an orchestral score may realize this, but it's not just a matter of sort of crunching down all the notes, because I am a French horn player, and I am married to a string player, and to try to explain that you can't just lift the French horn notes out and just transfer them to someone else's staff. You have to actually change what the pitches are first and understand how they're jumping across octaves, and it's all a mess. And you have had to go through and, as a pianist, right, figure all of that out and figure out how not only to make it happen on the piano, but make it happen with 4 people's hands interlocking on one keyboard, with the counterpoint intact, because that's the thing that people love about Bach. I know that's the thing that I do. So Bach, obviously, very well known for counterpoint, right? For this very intricate writing, but he could also write a heck of a melody. Many people who don't know very much Bach still know the air on the G string, the second movement of Suite Number 3. And so you play this in transcription with Susan on this album. And, you're ornamenting. It's such a lovely reading of the melody. I really treasure this recording. It sort of rewired my own understanding of how that tune works. And actually, we have the audio. We love to hear music during these Q&As, because That's the thing that we're all here for. And so let's now listen to your and Susan Sobolewski's interpretation of this second movement from Suite Number 3. So this is the famous air on the G string for piano, four hands in its entirety off of Eleonor Bindman's new album. All right. For those of you out there who are just joining us on this Noxos Live Q&A being hosted in collaboration with Archive Music, welcome. We are listening to Eleonor Bindman's new album, transcriptions of Bach's orchestral suites for piano duet, featuring Eleanor's own transcriptions and her own playing as well, with her duet partner Susan Sobolewski, who's the other half of Duo Vivace. So we just heard the air on the G string, the second movement of Suite Number 3. Eleanor, thanks again for being here. How do you approach interpretation when it comes to Bach excerpts that are so familiar to people and so part of the fabric of everyday life?
Well, initially with a lot of dread, actually, because it's daunting, and for this particular set of 4 orchestral suites, it was the air, which, despite everyone calling it air and G string, which I will touch upon briefly in a moment, it's not an air, it's just air. And it's the only air movement in the suites. And of course, the Badinerie, which was the trailer in the beginning of this Q&A started with. But the Badinerie was a little less daunting because it's a short and light piece and, puts people in a certain type of a mood, which always works. Now, with this air, to be completely frank, it was never one of my favorite pieces. And I found it, it's very long. And the upper register strings, it gets a bit monotonous. So how does one translate this to the keyboard, without doing something that's so radical that people, of course, there are always some people who will question what one does. And as we briefly mentioned in the previous question, you're reducing something for the piano. Of course, we know that in the world of classical music, there are the original instrument people. There's this camp, and I get this a lot, on Facebook and from people. Another Bach on the piano again. Haven't we had enough Bach on the piano? And it's like, okay, are you still drinking your red wine from silver goblets? I don't think so. I think you're using glass. So there are always those people, and in a sense, when you're putting out something that's going to be streaming there, arguably forever, or at least until our planet explodes, there's one needs to think about, I'm putting this out there, it's always going to be there. So you don't want to ruffle too many feathers, and you want to keep the integrity of the piece. So to get back to what I did, there were several drafts of the air. And because I'm very concerned with the equal partnership of the two pianists, one option was always to transpose the theme. And obviously it couldn't go any higher, so it had to be an octave lower. And of course, in the process of transcribing all of these pieces, it was a necessity very often to change the octaves, as you were mentioning before, as far as instrumentation, because you can't have all the voices blend. So for the counterpoint to be heard, you need to put what we call transpose and put the music in a different octave. So there were several drafts that I did. And then the one starting in the lower register just seemed most interesting because it automatically, as you mentioned, shifted one's perception of the piece, because we're used to hearing it higher. And then it made perfect sense for the other partner, the top voice, to take the melody on the iteration, on the repeat, which of course you have to have. So that really took very good care of erasing this monotony, this one kind of dimension quality of the piece. And then, of course, there's the matter of character. And one of the reasons that this piece was not my favorite to listen to is it somehow it has this very sentimental quality in the orchestral rendition. And I, for whatever reasons, nature and nurture, all my piano teachers were Russian, sentimentality was kind of frowned upon. And I also find it's not a part of my personality very much. So I like the more, in a way, drier, less emotional, a little faster. I don't know if you noticed, but the tempo is a bit faster than normal. And it's, in a way, it's more as a matter of fact. So the music becomes, it's more meditative in a way. It's less sentimental and more meditative. And just to touch briefly on the name, I actually didn't know that myself before I started researching, because everybody would say air and G string, and I'm like, no, it's air. It's not air. Where did the G string come from? And apparently, I think most people may know that, but I didn't. It was actually transcribed by a violinist whose name I can't pronounce right now. And he transcribed it an octave lower so that he could play the piece on the G string of the violin, hence the G string. But we're not hearing that particular version when we're hearing the air and G strings. I personally haven't heard that version. Perhaps I should have researched and listened to it, but only after I transcribed this initial iteration of the melody an octave lower did I realize, oh, well, that guy was obviously thinking the same as I was. And that's why it's called air and G string, but Bach just called it air, and it had nothing to do with the G string until much later.
Right. And so this artifact of a previous transcription process ends up being sort of a common name for something that Bach just gave, which also air is sort of a generic name, right? Like it just sort of means
it means like an aria, yeah.
Right.
It's the same provenance as the word aria, yes. Right.
Yeah. And as you were pointing out, this is an aria in among dance types, right?
Exactly.
All these things like gavottes and minuets, and then we stop for an aria. And it is, right. In your reading, it is this very meditative moment where, maybe we don't need to dance right now. So.
Right. And I was, when you're talking about how to approach this, after I figured out that transcription will be this, it usually takes some time for a piece to come into its own as far as character. I play it until it feels right. And I was not in the process, and after the recording, one always thinks, oh, well, I liked, what was I thinking? Or I don't like it now, I liked it then. And you always, at least I, second guess myself. But the mordant, certain, they just felt right. And, in general, I kind of had this approach. If I wasn't sure if I should do something, if it seemed maybe a little too different or too strange, I was just hoping that people will keep in mind that, in a way, I have a little bit of a license because, I did do all this work. And, if I want to put a little flourish in there, even if it's not to some people's liking, which is perfectly fine, I just figured, well, it feels good to me. This is how I like it. And this is how I'm going to do it. And I don't know if you noticed, but on that particular recording, Susan and I actually don't do the same ornaments. And I thought that was also fine, because in some movements, we really needed to coordinate what we're doing. But in some other ones, one just needs to put things out that feel right, and hope for the best. But I'm very happy with the result. And as a matter of fact, this track was already included in the very popular iTunes Apple Music playlist, which I was very happy about, because through that piece, the album is getting very, very good streaming exposure.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, we can't subtract out the context of the streaming economy and everything, right? Like Grand Piano, like any other contemporary record label, is putting things out not just on physicals through retail websites like Archive, but it is also, placing things on streaming playlists and all. And so lots of people are hearing your album in all these different ways. So talking more about music and actually sort of getting back to the dance movements, in Suite Number 2, there's this Polonaise, calling out to my own ancestry a little bit. And the Polonaise in Double, it has this very crisp quality, I think, in your interpretation. Almost harpsichord-like. I know you have played harpsichord on occasion in the past. But, every once in a while in this track, some subtle gesture will remind us of the fact that a piano can do certain things that harpsichord can't, right? And so let's hear the way you and Susan articulate this transcription of the Polonaise in double. So this is going to be suite number 2, everyone. Orchestral suite number 2, the Polonaise in double. Let's just hear the whole thing. All right, for those who are just joining us, or those who are, maybe entering a few minutes without being reminded of who we are and what we're doing here. Welcome to this Noxos Live Q&A, hosted with archive music of Eleonor Bindman, whose new album of her own transcriptions of Bach's orchestral suites for a piano duet is out now via Grand Piano Records. You can buy a physical copy on Archive Music or other retail sites. You can stream it anywhere you stream great music. And we just heard the Polonaise and double from suite number 2 there, this very crisply articulated thing. And my question for you, Eleonor, and thanks again for being here, is you have played harpsichord on occasion in the past. You're obviously playing on a modern piano now, and we'll talk more about the exact piano a little bit later, but how does that experience of having played harpsichord and just having played a lot of Bach keyboard music, inform your pianism on this album?
There's certainly a lot to say about that. And as you mentioned before, Nick, the piano somehow does have the capability of sounding different. Even though the mechanism is that of essentially a percussion instrument, at least I was taught from a young age that when I play a Beethoven sonata, I need to listen to a Beethoven symphony to understand the context of it. And throughout my, musical life, and especially in preparation for recordings, which I ended up taking extremely seriously, it's very important for me to know exactly how I want to play something. Because otherwise I don't feel that I can in any way hold the audience's attention or be convincing. It's really not, it seems too risky to leave things to accident. And especially in the case of Bach and these dances, for example, there are also the repeats. In this particular movement that we just heard, the Polonaise is repeated twice. Well, it's rather, there's a Polonaise with the repeats, then there's a doublé with the repeats, then there's a Polonaise again. And as meticulous as it may seem, I actually, for every one of these movements, as I always did whenever I perform any of the Bach's partitas or any works that I ever played, I made a decision as to how am I going to play the repeats. And for me personally, it makes no sense to play it exactly the same way. So the harpsichord sound is a very important part of the arsenal of my interpretive thinking and my decisions. Having played the harpsichord, the visceral feeling, the completely different connection between the touch and the sound that you get, and the physical position of the fingers, which almost has to be different in the harpsichord, was definitely an eye-opening experience. And I make decisions in certain movements to try to reproduce that sound, or obviously, to get close, or at least as I am recording or performing, I have that sound in mind, and somehow it translates into a different type of a sound. There's also the organ, which I unfortunately don't have a lot of experience playing, but in a way it's easy to imagine playing the organ, and the sound is so compelling. And certainly in some of the movements, especially actually in the overtures, because the overtures of these 4 suites are very complicated, usually 2 layer works where there is a slow introduction and then there's a very interesting fugue, and that's a consistent part in the structure of these suites, which are then followed by short dances, which, if I may go off on a brief tangent, is very different from the Brandenburgs, because the Brandenburgs are 3-movement orchestral works where the first and the last movement are incredibly complex and very contrapuntal, and usually in the middle, except for in the G major and the 3rd concerto, there's a slow movement, which is a very beautiful, as you said, it's a heck of a melody usually, and there's some accompaniment. So in the orchestral suites, it was almost a natural choice in the overtures, for example, to think of the organ or of the orchestra for that matter, and in the fugue to think maybe of the strings or of the keyboard. And in this particular movement that we just heard, there's actually a flute solo as well, because the 2nd suite in general, which I think is the most popular one, that's where the Badnerie, the last movement, is from, which is as recognizable as the air. It's a very lovely work. I think maybe even partially due to the key, because Bach just had a way with B minor, the B minor mass, and there's just something about the different keys. And this particular 2nd suite, the flute solo that we heard in the doublé, for example, I was very much trying to imitate the flute as much as I could. Obviously, I couldn't prolong the sound, but there's a lot of research that went into this, as when making the transcription, I listened to very, very, very many orchestral recordings as well. And I took some interpretive cues from them, as far as different sounds and different tempi. And in this particular movement, when the last iteration of the Polonaise comes, I actually did something that on the piano seems a little more jarring, but there's an appoggiatura that in the orchestral score, one of the solo instruments is the flute and the other is the violin. So in the orchestra, things sound a lot more kind of evened out. But on the piano, we had one person, which was me on the top on the primo in this particular suite. I was actually emphasizing the dissonant appoggiatura, where Susan was playing the straight theme. And I thought it sounded really cool, on the piano and kind of a little jazzy, but I only did it once because if I chose to do it 3 times, then, as the Naxos people sometimes say, there might be raised eyebrows, so we don't want to have too many of those. But variety, to come kind of full circle, variety is very important to me as a person. I can be very patient, but I don't like to do things the same way. It's not interesting to me. So I take into account not only the harpsichord and the organ or the flute, there's the violin, there's the French horn, which is wonderful to reproduce on the piano, actually, in the Brandenburgs. And so I try for all of these dances. The Brandenburgs didn't have this necessity because there's a 3-movement contrast. But all of these dances, if they weren't essentially different from one another as far as tempo, I really try to, in the sequence, to bring a different aspect and a different character, a different touch, more harpsichord, more guitar for something else. Because I think that makes for a more interesting rendition for the listener.
Sure. Yeah, I'm thinking of when Mahler put together his conflation of the 4 orchestral suites into one suite, one 4-movement sort of quasi symphony. He was apparently adding organ wherever he possibly could, and also was hauling around on tour this piano full of thumbtacks so it would sound more like a harpsichord. People have done all sorts of things with these suites, but I think the appoggiatura you played was less radical than that, maybe a little bit. But
Well, I'm not Mahler. One must know one's place in the universe, and I'm not on that level. But it was cool to know. I actually didn't know what you just talked about as far as it was his thing, and that's really interesting. Like this transcription is kind of my thing, and it's the fun aspect of it is that you can do these little things. But I personally am not the type of I don't really I don't feel entitled to change the piece or to add things. And that's also a comment that I've had even in the reviews sometimes. Oh, well, what kind, this is an arrangement. Why not add this, or why not do this? Why not do more? And it's a choice, because I have too much respect for Bach, and I'll do a little bit, but I've actually heard people talk about Glenn Gould and saying, when he plays Bach, you don't hear Bach, you hear Glenn Gould. I want people to hear Bach, because I just feel like I'm, a channel, one of many, like any musician who plays him, like through which I want him to become more accessible to more people, so they could play certain works that they hitherto were not able to play.
Right, and that's a beautiful thing. I do want to briefly remind anyone watching right now that they are absolutely free and encouraged to drop comments and questions into the chat window wherever you're watching this. On Facebook, Eugene Sedita, for instance, just logged in to say that he's really enjoying this and finds Eleanor very well spoken and enlightening, and I agree. So there are all sorts of things I love about this album, and one of the things that I personally have been obsessing over is the Furlan movement in Suite Number 1. For me, it's proof of the potential of the piano for hands to create what sounds like a sort of a hyper solo rather than an ensemble performance. Eleanor, welcome back to the screen. You've actually put a fair amount of rehearsal footage of you working on this album onto YouTube, and you can see you and Susan Sobolewski playing together. So let's actually watch some of that rehearsal footage now. We have a little bit of video of you playing through the Furlano from Suite Number 1. And it's just fascinating to watch you actually doing it in real time, especially because it's such a hard movement. So let's see a little bit of that video right now.
Where it was, it's sort of.
Let's try to play it once, not just kind of like we're enjoying ourselves because we practice. You know, it's my issue. Enjoyment. I know you're always enjoying yourself. I'm the one that's.
As they say, fake it till we make it.
Right.
All right, so that was the rehearsal footage, right? That wasn't the polished final result. Now let's actually hear what that resulted in, which is the actual finished, sort of recorded, committed to wax version of this Furlano from Suite Number 1 on your new album from Grand Piano. So let's listen to that now for comparison. All right. Thank you so much for that musical gift, Eleanor. So what led you to make this record with Susan, who has not always necessarily been your duet partner on your transcription recordings, but who is the other half of your group Duo Vivace? And what can you tell us about working with her on this particular track?
Well, I certainly am glad that we're having some talk about Susan, because she's a huge part of even the motivation, as we spoke before, for my making a transcription, because she and I, when we met back in 1990s in Vladimir Feltzman's master classes at SUNY New Paltz, which I was then doing my master's degree in piano pedagogy, we really hit it off. We became very close friends, and playing four hands was just a way of spending more time together. And as you said, she is definitely my longest and most steady friend and piano partner. And we actually recorded an album that I'm still very happy with, I think about exactly 20 years ago, called Out of the Blue, with works by Bernstein. We did Holst the Planet for two pianos, which of course, by the way, was the original version of the Planets that Holst himself created. And then he orchestrated it, and as well as Rhapsody in Blue by Gershwin. And we enjoyed a long and fruitful collaboration, and we performed quite a bit. And then we both had children. So things became a little different. And I'm very happy that she was actually available to work with me on this particular recording, because she is a very busy life. She's a college professor and also a teacher and so on. So I was very happy that I was telling her, okay, the orchestral suites are coming. As I gave her a very long notice, and I said, I really would like to do this with you, and she very kindly agreed and was excited about the project. So she planned ahead and set out some time for these rehearsals, which are really extremely important, especially in the context of a new transcription, because one of the stages, the later stage, is when I think I've done a transcription, and I have to really try to play it with someone else, because of course I only have two hands. And even though in the earlier stages, very slowly, as far as the sonorities, I actually did things myself. But when we started rehearsing, there were many, many changes, and it actually required a lot of patience and kindness on Susan's part, because basically from one rehearsal to the next of the same movement, it would be a slightly different version, if not completely different one. So it was not easy, but we're really used to working together, and we know kind of the protocol. As a piano duet, there's certain things that you learn that are good shortcuts and not. And as far as this particular piece, the Furlano, Furlane, I'm actually not sure how to pronounce it. I don't hear the word said that often. This was probably the most difficult piece for the two of us to coordinate, that we have spent the most time working on. And of course, Susan has the primo part for the first suite, and she had a very, very difficult task, which she came out, with flying colors. The melody on the top hand and her right hand, and then the very complex left hand, which needs to be seamlessly, acoustically and technically and rhythmically coordinated with my right hand. And we're actually playing thirds in most of that middle voice. So our hands are extremely close together. And I had to actually arrange it so that sometimes in literally 2 or 3 notes in a row, I would play thirds, that she would play thirds, just so it would be viable to play in a certain tempo. And of course, the question of balance of this, in the orchestra, it's very easy to tone down the strings and make them sound fluid. And for the opera voice, violins to sing out. But on the piano, it's very difficult to have longer upper notes in the upper register and then have many notes going on in the middle and not have that overpower. And then there's the bass. So it really took a lot of iterations beyond what you saw on that YouTube video, which was kind of candid, but I'm glad that you didn't think it was too candid to include here, because we did have some fun and back and forth as we were rehearsing. But this particular coordination of my right hand and her left hand, we literally went through just that part probably a few dozen times. Well, a couple of dozen. Practicing together as a piano duet is really imperative. It's really difficult to just learn your part and then be able to play together because, as you said, the hands are close together. You need to coordinate whose hands is going to be higher, whose hands are going to be lower in that middle part of the keyboard. And that was quite an adventure, but I'm happy with the way this piece came out. I'm glad you chose it. It's a very beautiful and also a singular movement as far as the movement of that name, as far as I know in Bach. You know, there are plenty of minuets and bourrées and gavottes, but I think only one for Lane.
Yeah. There's one in Tombeau de Couperin, the Ravel piece.
Right.
But yeah, as far as I know, it was a fairly infrequent choice for folks to compose as part of those Baroque suites.
Right.
So we have lots of love for you and your project over in the comments. Greetings and congratulations from places like Mexico City. Lots of comments that you have sort of given us a refreshed version of a lot of this music that many of us have heard many times and that some of us have heard, just a few times. So we're running up on the end of our time together, but we do have a few more minutes left. And I do have a couple of questions still burning a hole in my brain, if that makes sense. So let's talk about the instrument, because Bösendorfer, this legendary Viennese piano maker, started building extended range instruments partially because Busoni, who you mentioned earlier, this person whose name is so often hyphenated with Bach's because of transcriptions, he wanted to transcribe his hero's music without sacrificing that pedal register and sacrificing the power that you can get in the left hand. So what do you wish listeners knew about this piano, about the diversity of pianos that are available today? And why did you choose the Bösendorfer for your own recording?
Well, I'm, first and foremost, I'm very fortunate to actually own one. And in the process of looking for a new piano, which I knew was going to be, maybe my last piano, because they're a formidable expense and investment for a pianist. I tried, just about any piano I couldn't. Being in New York City wasn't a problem. I think Bösendorfer is absolutely singular as far as the quality of sonority in the lower middle register. And unless I had access to Bösendorfer, I would never have transcribed the cello suites, for example. And I think the cello suites are actually a very popular product of mine. But had I had a different instrument, I would never even dreamed of it, because there's no way that the richness, the sonority, the clarity could be conveyed on any other instrument. So those, of course, as most of us know, there are extra keys on the Bösendorfer in the bottom, which are not played, they're painted black, but the extra strings that correspond to these keys create a very different sonority than, I won't name any names, but let's say than the most popular piano that we know of here in the States, which everybody worships. But the register that the Bösendorfer so lovingly is basically the cello register. And on a lot of other pianists, pianos, it sounds muddy and not as deep and full-bodied. So, of course, as you mentioned, Busoni wanted to transcribe Bach's organ works, and that created those low octaves, the pedal. I think by virtue of the Bösendorfer being an Austrian instrument, it's a lot better known in Europe. And of course, for logistical reasons, there's many more of them. I know that in conservatories, for example, in the Frankfurt Conservatory, it's the only instrument that they have in the classroom. So I wouldn't dream of making a recording not on the Bösendorfer. The Brandenburg Duets recording was made in the studio with a wonderful Steinway and different microphone placement and in a church. So the sonority difference can be heard, but I get a lot of comments about the particular sonority of the Bosendorfer. And I think also my partitas recording, the complete partitas recording that came out on a Delos label in the spring, also has a very unique sound because it is recorded in the Bosendorfer. And I dare say I don't know of another partitas recording that was made in that instrument. And people talk about how clear my left hand is. And of course, it's partially because I think the left hand is as important as the right when it comes to Bach, but also because on the Bosendorfer, and because of my recording engineer, Sam Ward, who fortunately also happens to be a neighbor, so I'm very lucky. He's an amazing technician. He knows what he's doing. But that particular register will not be surpassed or even come close to by any other brand of piano. So there.
Wonderful. Well, it's clear from the comments and just from, sort of looking at how much streaming and how much physical sales your record's been getting that people are really connecting with this, right? People are really loving it. And of course, a quick reminder, you can find a physical copy of Eleanor's album on Archive Music, as well as her other albums. That Delos recording, that's also up there. And any streaming website, obviously, that you prefer. One last question, I think, because we've been talking a lot about Bach. We're getting all these thanks and congratulations from folks around the world, talking about how wonderful it is that you've brought Bach to people in this new light. On your website, you describe yourself as a Bach enthusiast, which feels like a little bit of an understatement to me. I get it, though. And for the unconverted out there, or maybe for those who are just discovering Bach's music, what is your best pitch for his music, aside from the recorded output that makes the argument for you?
I think enthusiast is a pretty good word because, there are so many others. But the reason that I undertook all of these projects is precisely because, having played a lot of Bach on the keyboard, I realized that for many people, it's not so easy. And again, the cross-section of professional virtuosos versus the people who love and play the piano at home, the percentage of the virtuosos are very small, and the adult amateurs and people who end up enjoying my transcriptions presently is a huge amount of people. And I think there's a reason why they love Bach, and there's a reason why everyone loves Bach. And I'm not really sure how to plug his music in a way that may not feel maybe slightly strange, but in one of the reviews of my partitas, someone in a German magazine wrote that his music are, sounds from the universe. It's a new language from the universe, and I think that the reason that he is so popular is because he's a very clear example of someone whose musical language is very abstract and very ineffable in a way, because you can't, unlike Chopin, you can't say that, oh, this is a sad piece, or you don't feel an emotion that, or sentiment, as we're speaking before. You feel a message, however, and there's a different message in a beautiful melody than, let's say, in the fugue. But I think most people who appreciate Bach, they understand that there's something there that helps them connect with, there's a message that they get, and it's not a verbal message, and it's not a message they hear every day, yet it's a very, it's a very nourishing, very spiritually fulfilling, it's a very intimate message. And I think it's a very important message for, many people who are seeking more solace or more contentment, or more relaxation. It's something, it taps into a part of our brain that needs to be listened to in a way. So the motivation of all of these recordings, which very fortunately became appreciated. And I really appreciate this particular time of us together, because it really helps people hear and understand a little bit better of what's going on, and hear Bach's music in a new light. I do want to bring it to people who would be able to play it, because essentially Bach's own keyboard output specifically is either very easy or very difficult. And especially for non-professionals as adult amateurs, Bach particularly is very difficult to really, it takes a very long time to learn, let's say, a fugue. And just because the hands are each doing their own thing, and there are not many repetitions, it becomes very frustrating. So for me, it was very important to give people access to these pieces that they love and they would love to reproduce and feel so gratified, without spending months or frustration or comparison to the, famous pianists out there. It's something that they can play, and it does feel like it's the real, true music. And for students and amateurs alike, it's really a new body of repertoire, and especially as far as, I don't know if I can take another minute, but I think we didn't talk about the piano duet repertoire and the piano duet medium in general very much. And when I was growing up, in the Russian school, the Soviet Union, the main piano book, there was only one, and it was fantastic. And literally from the second or third lesson, you played your couple of notes and your teacher was playing a duet with you. And there was the sense, wow, I'm making music. I don't know what the heck I'm doing, but it sounds really great, and I'm a part of it. So in my Russian school, or any Russian teachers, the duets were used so much as tools, and yet the repertoire that we have, save for the Schubert fantasy, which everyone thinks about when they think of duets, and then the Mozart sonatas, there's really not a body of work that one can sink one's teeth into. And I'm really hoping that in time, the Brandenburg duets and these two bodies of work, which are about many hours of enjoyment and many different movements of different levels of difficulty. The orchestral suites dances are mostly not that difficult, whereas the overtures and the Brandenburg duets movements are difficult. But there's just so much material, and I'm very happy that I had an opportunity to be able to bring it. And I'm hoping that my next project is to try to put the word out to teachers, because one can only do so much. But I really appreciate this time with you, Nick, and Naxos and Archive Music for letting me put some focus on what is going on and why am I doing what I'm doing. And as you said, hearing Bach in a new way, somebody recently told me that actually the piano medium, the counterpoint on the piano does make Bach's music more clear. And listening to an orchestral version of orchestral suites or the Brandenburgs is actually a very different experience, where the counterpoint, because of the sonorities, is really obscured. And somehow on the piano, you really hear the lines and kind of the skeletal aspects of this music more clearly. And it does come for refreshing. It does make for a refreshing experience, I think.
Yeah, and I guess just a closing reminder, everyone who's watching right now, you can find copies of not just this most recent recording of the orchestral suites, but the cello suites, all these other transcriptions that Eleonor has done on Archive Music. You can find it anywhere that records by Delos, Grand Piano, all of these various labels sell their work. You can stream her music all over the place, Spotify, wherever you prefer, Apple Music. And thank you, Eleonor, for talking with us, for going into such depth. It really seems like people enjoyed the degree to which you got into the details of how this all works and how the artistry comes together on that logistical level. For those who have been watching, please feel free to subscribe to these social media streams that we put together. We talk to many artists in many media who play many instruments, sing, do research on music. And of course, Eleonor does a little bit of all of that, maybe not so much the singing. But
No.
we
And
have,
also, I'm sorry, I just wanted to mention
Yeah.
that the transcriptions are available on Naxos sheet music sites and also on my website. And most of them are available actually electronically as PDFs, and they do sell very well all over the world. So if you know anyone in your life who might benefit from some fresh material, please come on over and check them out.
Yeah, head to Eleanor's website. That's the real destination. There's so much on there. So we have a little bit of a send off. We mentioned earlier that Eleanor has plenty of rehearsal footage, things like that on YouTube. And you can really continue the deep dive into this album and all of her work on there as well. It takes a lot of recording just to make one of these professional albums happen. And we have, as a sort of send off for you all going into the rest of your day, take 75 of many in a single day in the recording process of Eleanor's album. Eleanor, thank you one more time for being here. And we'll look forward to hearing whatever the next project is.
It was an absolute pleasure, and thank you very much for everyone who took the time to listen.
Yeah. All right. Have a great day, everyone.